कभी करती हैं मुलाकातें, कभी करती हैं मुलाकातें, कभी यादों में बरसातें, किताबें करती हैं बातें, किताबें करती हैं बातें। मन की गहरी झील में कूद जाती हैं कभी, सोच के दरिया के संग संग बहती जाती हैं कभी। चाहे शाम हो या हो रातें, किताबें करती हैं बातें।
Hello and welcome to Kitabnama, where it is a pleasure to be speaking today to Veena Venugopal, a journalist who's just published her second book called The Mother-in-Law, The Other Woman in Your Marriage. When I picked up your book, The Mother-in-Law, you look at the cover, the older woman with a balan, the younger woman with a frying pan, and I just made the presumption, mistaken presumption, that this is going to be a funny book full of bad jokes and cliches about mothers-in-law. And then I started reading it, and I have to confess that I found it so dark at places that I would have to put it down just to come up for breath. So is this real?
It is. I mean, all the stories are real, and I don't blame you for the sort of assumption that it was a funny book, because that was the assumption with which I started writing the book. You know how it is when a bunch of women meet and the conversation always turns to the mother-in-law, and you sort of crack a few jokes about what happened at your home, and oh no, my mother-in-law's worse, she did this, and I thought that was what the book would be. But as I started talking to these women, and I think two things happened. One, because they were talking to me for a book, they were more serious about how they approached it. And B, because they knew that I was going to change their names, and they didn't know me personally. They were far more honest than had I met them socially. So as I started talking to these women, the stories kept getting darker and darker. And I was then in a dilemma as to what should I do with this book, because should I keep it funny or should I keep it honest? And I thought, well, you know, if the reality out there is dark, then it's not fair on my part to trivialize it for humor. And so I just decided to be honest about the stories that I was writing, at the cost of sort of changing the whole tone and tenor that I had in my mind for the book.
We are in 2014, over 20 years away from liberalization, and we are still talking about the big bad mother-in-law?
Actually, curiously, we are talking more about it now, Namita, than we were before. And what I discovered in the course of the research for the book is that this is perhaps the worst generation for the mother-in-law story in India. It's essentially because of liberalization. So, you know, when my mother got married, or when my grandmother got married, she would have been happy to be told what she's supposed to do, because she must have been 16 and, you know, not really educated, completely not exposed at all, in fact, to the outside world. So the mother-in-law to her was a tutor of sort, and, you know, and it was a proper sort of handing over of the kin of the family, so to speak. And then when my mother got married in the 70s, I mean, she had a college education, but she was not raised to be ambitious or have a career. And so again, she found it okay to be told by her mother-in-law what she can do and what she can't. But since liberalization, or since the 80s in fact, where education has sort of gained prominence, a lot more daughters are thankfully being educated now. A lot of them go to work before they get married, and especially in industries like IT, they travel a lot as well, and through cable TV and others, internet, there is so much access to how the rest of the world lives. And so here then is a 24-year-old who knows what she wants, who knows how she wants to live her life, getting married, going into a family, and suddenly being told, oh, well, in our family we don't wear clothes like that. Therefore, I think that this is this sort of inflection point of the mother-in-law conflict in India. And it's particularly poignant if you look at pop culture. through the 70s and the 80s and even the early part of the 90s, we watched family shows which were based on comedy, or which were based on, or the drama was on loss or poverty or or things like that. In the last 15 years, all the TV shows, all the soaps on TV are entirely about the Saas Bahu conflict, and that is because it is a problem now, a bigger problem now certainly than it was 20 years back. Hence, it was surprising for me that that so much of it is going on, but when I thought back, it made sense that this would be an issue now, and maybe not such a big issue 20 years ago.
So in a sense, media reflecting social reality, and
It's a
not
bit
just
of
social reality being made up for a little bit of masala on TV.
It is a bit of a vicious cycle. I think because the TV shows a lot of facts in fiction, and people see it, they think that it's okay to do that. And because there is a lot of drama in actual households, TV feels that it's okay to stretch it a little bit and show it. So I find that to be a vicious cycle. And the only other observation that I want to share about the TV shows is that of the women that I spoke to, the ones who were facing the worst troubles at home were the ones who were the most hooked onto these shows. So this girl I call Keisha, who's probably one of the terribly dark stories in the book.
I think that is the worst. Actually, I felt her mother-in-law belonged to jail.
Yeah, she should go to jail,
she should actually
for
go to jail.
abetment.
Yes.
But when she told me that she was hooked onto these shows, and I was shocked. I said, there is so much going on in your life. Why do you want to watch it on TV? She said, but it makes me feel okay that other daughters-in-law are going through things like that. So that's the other thing about the TV shows bit, that people who didn't have much trouble didn't identify much with it and probably avoided watching it. But the ones who were hooked on were ones who had some sort of points of entry into that story from their own life.
Just to talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of this book. So you interviewed, you have 11 stories.
Yeah.
You have 11, and, well, not including your own, which becomes the 12th story.
Yeah.
And then how many women did you actually speak to?
About 60 to 80, depending on how intensely I spoke to them. So a breadth of women across the country. But I was very sure from the beginning that I wanted it to be limited to a certain demographic, because there are stories in, say, rural areas or among other classes which are different, but I thought it would confuse the issue too much. So, so the sample size for the book is entirely from the demographic, which is educated, English-speaking, urban households,
Right.
middle-class households.
But
So
you do have quite a range of ages, including a 60-year-old
Yeah.
daughter-in-law who actually spoke to you as both, as a mother-in-law and
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
an oppressed daughter-in-law.
yeah, and I love that story because it's a happy ending.
Yes, I think that is perhaps one of the few that has. Well, there are a couple.
Yeah.
So what? Two questions then. One is, I'm asking you that is this a relationship that is fated for failure?
It isn't, and I'm hopeful that the next generation will be a lot better, because these educated, exposed daughters-in-law are going to be mothers-in-law themselves, and I feel that they will bring that education and that experience and that exposure and redefine the dynamic of their relationship with the
That's
daughter-in-law.
true, but I'm sorry to interrupt, but one would presume that all these mothers-in-law are also have been at some point of their life oppressed and bullied and pushed around. So you would imagine a little bit more sympathy, but it doesn't happen. So why does this somehow, almost by a process of osmosis, go from generation to generation?
It does not happen, and I think that is the one big fallacy of this sort of happy Indian family, and the other fallacy is that you look after your elderly. And I think just 2 days ago, the newspaper reported that the largest abuse of the elderly was by their daughters-in-law,
By the sons and daughters.
Yeah, so it's sort of a reverse. It sort of works you know, it's like I want to finish this cycle right now. She was nasty to me the first 20 years. Now my mother-in-law is indisposed or ill, and so here
Revenge.
is my chance to get back at her. So therefore, I find this notion of, oh, in India, you know, our joint families are the best sort of solution, and everyone pitches in and everyone looks out for the other. I'm a bit cynical about it now. I'm not so sure if that is ideal.
So you are taking on India's most revered, holiest institution, which is the family, and then within that institution you are taking on the holiest of the holies, which is the mother. Did you expect a backlash, or have you received any kind of feedback?
Strangely, the feedback has been more positive than I expected. I thought there would be a backlash, because I do say it in the book that the joint family is the bane of the daughter-in-law. But a lot of people who have written to me or tweeted to me have all said that they agree with that, and that, you know, thank you for saying it, and, you know, you were brave enough to say it, and so on and so forth. The only backlash that I've received is that these are stereotypes, and that's the only criticism that I'm a little sensitive to, because unfortunately I started off not wanting to write about the stereotype, but the reality is the stereotype. So should I have written a book about the 5% minority of good mothers-in-law? No. I'm happy that I stuck to the 95% nasty mothers-in-law. And you may have a good story, but, you know, unfortunately that doesn't travel. So
you speak about your own relationship with your mother-in-law that went from benign to hostile pretty fast after the birth of your daughter.
Yeah.
And could you just tell us something about that?
So when I got married, the only sort of conscious decision I took was that I didn't want my relationship with my mother-in-law to be a cliche, and it wasn't. Fortunately, we didn't share a language. So in the first few years of my marriage, although my mother-in-law speaks English, she speaks it with some effort. So it's not an easy conversation to have. So in the first few years of my marriage, I'd you know, just talk to her once on the phone every 10 days. Hi, hello, how are you? Is everything okay? And it was great. It's only when I had my daughter that my mother-in-law came to stay with me that we sort of very easily fell into the cliche, and small things would set it off. And we were both non-confrontational people, so I wouldn't take her up on something that she did which annoyed me, but it would like fester in my head, and I'd be thinking, oh God, how could she? And soon enough, you know, the whole sort of air in the house became vile, and I was resenting everything she was doing, and she was resenting everything I was doing, and I was a new mother, and I was confused and depressed as it was, and, you know, and she would tell me, oh, the baby is ill because you did this, and I was like, oh, I can't deal with this. At the same time, my mother was also with me, and my mother would behave in the exact same way that my mother-in-law would, but the fact that I could yell at my mother, you know, and I could tell her, please, mom, like, let me be.
Back off. And you can't say that to your mother-in-law.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in the book, Supriya's story is one of the ones with a happy ending, because she finally figured out a way where she could tell her mother-in-law that, I think now you're overstepping your limits. And I think that's a very wise thing, which I was not capable of doing. If I would just tell her in a nice way, Mummy, you know, please don't say that, or, you know, Mummy, I don't think you know what went on, and, you know, that's the wrong thing to say. My relationship with her would have been far better, but I just chose to pretend like she wasn't getting to me, and she was.
I had one question actually about the book, which is that, of course, except for Lalita, who you've spoken to in both her roles as a daughter-in-law as well as a mother-in-law, you haven't really included the other perspective. And surely there has to be, because when you were talking about your mother-in-law, I was just thinking, my God, it must be difficult for her to leave her home, to come and live in someone's home. You're not really a guest, you're not really a mother. What are you? You're a grandmother. It must be difficult for the other woman too.
Yeah. So we thought about that, you know, how much of the mother-in-law should be in the mother-in-law. there were two problems. One is that the daughters-in-law wouldn't be in a position to be entirely honest with me if they knew that I was also talking to their mother-in-law. So therefore then, do you include random other mothers-in-laws and their stories? And we thought maybe that's best left for another book.
For another book.
Yeah.
I was just going to say maybe you need a sequel on the daughter-in-law, because I'm sure just as there is the big bad mother-in-law, you also do have the big bad daughter-in-law.
Yeah, certainly.
What if I was to ask you, what is that one area of conflict? Is it the control over the husband, or the man, with the mother feels she's losing her son to this new woman? What is it? What is that one area?
I think at the core, the problem is one of boundaries, and again, I have to sort of take the shiny example of the big Indian joint family, where everyone's on everyone's toes all the time. So there are no clear boundaries set. Everyone's free to criticize everyone else, and therefore, if the son husband at the center of this argument were to take a stance and lay down that boundary, then a lot of these conflicts wouldn't exist. It's the fact that the mother-in-law is not your mother, but she behaves like your mother. So where does her role end? Is she allowed to tell you what you're supposed to wear? Is she allowed to tell you whether you can go to work or not? Is she allowed?
Well, is your mother allowed to tell you what to wear if you're an adult woman?
You aren't. She isn't. But then you can tell her, or you can defy.
Yeah.
But here, the defiance takes on a much bigger sort of proposition. The defiance is war, and I think in a lot of the cases, the women told me that when the first fight happens, one of the first things that their mothers-in-law throw at them is this how you were raised?
Oh dear.
So it's a direct attack on your family and your parents, and the fact that you are not raised right.
And a reminder that you are not one of us.
Oh, absolutely,
Yeah.
you're not one of us. I write about it, Anshika,
Yes.
whose mother-in-law told her very carefully that you are almost like a daughter to me, but
Yes.
not a daughter to me.
Yes.
And so that's the problem, that there has to be a boundary, there has to be a territory, and you should say, okay, you can tell me about 5 things, but no more. And I think the man at the center has to be the one leading.
So I'm going to come back to the man at the center. It looks like he's pretty much the villain of the piece, or the hero of the piece, whichever way you want to look at it. Because maybe if more men just stood up and said that, look, you're my mother, you're my wife, and just and it seems to me that too many men just don't want to take a stand. They're either too busy at work, or they've, like yours, has his nose buried in his BlackBerry and just pretends not to understand the tension that is brewing in the background.
Absolutely, and that is the whole sort of problem, and there I have 2 sort of explanations for it. And physiologically they say that in family situations, when there is conflict, one researcher has done this sort of blood pressure and heart rate and study, and he says that the signs are exactly those of when being attacked, and so you have a flight or fight option, and men always take the flight option, so they don't want to confront this issue. And sociologically, they don't feel part of it, because women are supposed to be the kin keepers of the family, so they don't really understand what this conflict is about, which is probably why fathers-in-law and sons-in-law are okay. There isn't so much drama around their relationship, because they haven't brought into how are things done in my family,
Or even mothers and sons-in-law. That dynamic doesn't seem to exist when you are dealing with the spouse of your daughter.
Absolutely, but in the West, the mother-in-law is an icon of humor, and the humor is around the mother-in-law and the son-in-law.
You do end this book with a little bit of advice,
Yeah.
and for the benefit of those who haven't read it, what would it be? Your quick 5 rules for all women who are about to get married and for all women who are about to welcome a daughter-in-law.
So, to women who are about to get married, I would think one of the biggest mistakes that women in the book made is that they would agree to the rules laid down by the mother-in-law before the wedding, thinking, oh well, I'll deal with it after. So if the mother-in-law says don't wear sleeveless, don't work, you know, or you're not supposed to go to your home for more than 3 days in a year, or whatever it is, they say, oh yes, 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 because they think, okay, if I say no, then I'm not going to be able to marry this guy. So therefore, it is, you know, it is fair that the mother-in-law feels cheated after the marriage when the daughter-in-law seems to be sort of going against these decisions. So I would think, don't agree to conditions before your marriage that you feel you won't be able to keep after your marriage. Be honest and upfront and say, these are things I can do and these are things I can't do, and see where it goes. And secondly, marry a man who's on your side.
Okay. That's good advice. Your 2 golden rules: don't agree to things you're not comfortable with, marry a man who will stick by you.
Yeah.
It's been a real pleasure talking to you, Veena, and it's been very insightful to read your book. Thank you.
तो नीरू एक नज़म है, क्योंकि मैं सारी उम्र मैंने पढ़ाया है, तो ये मेरे क्लासरूम का ही माहौल है, लेकिन अंत में जाकर जे कुछ बदल जाता है। सो ये नज़म है प्यारा। जिन्हां नूं मैं कदे कविता पढ़ाउंदा सां, किताबां विच छपे काले जहे हरफां चों रंग कढ़ने सिखाउंदा सां, ते जेड़े प्यार दी कविता कदी सुणदे तां एक दूजे नूं तक के मेथों चोरी मुस्कुराउंदे सन। ते कोई नज़म जद तेवर बदलदी सी, उन्हां दे नितरे निर्मल ते लहरे चेहरिਆਂ उत्ते बदलदे रंग मैनूं दसदे सन, सर ਅਸੀਂ कविता समझदे हां। उन्हां लगरां जहे मुंडिਆਂ चों एक दा नाम प्यारा सी, ਉਹ ਸਭ ਦੀ ਅੱਖ ਦਾ ਤਾਰਾ ਸੀ। ਮੈਂ ਉਸ ਤਾਰੇ ਨੂੰ ਫਿਰ ਅਸਮਾਨ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਦੇਖਿਆ ਸੀ, ਮੈਂ ਪਿਆਰਾ ਜਵਾਨ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਦੇਖਿਆ ਸੀ। ਉਹ ਗਾਉਂਦਾ ਸੀ ਤਾਂ ਕਾਲੀ ਪੌਣ ਵਿੱਚ ਦੀਵੇ ਜਗਾਉਂਦਾ ਸੀ। ਮੈਂ ਉਸ ਦੀ ਆਵਾਜ਼ ਨੂੰ ਉੱਠਦੇ ਉਤਾਂ ਸੁਣਿਆ, ਤੇ ਫਿਰ ਸੁਣਿਆ ਮੈਂ ਇੱਕ ਦਿਨ ਕੁਝ ਦਿਨਾਂ ਮਗਰੋਂ ਕਿ ਪਿਆਰੇ ਨੂੰ ਕਿਸੇ ਨੇ ਮਾਰ ਦਿੱਤਾ ਹੈ। ਤੇ ਮੈਂ ਇਹ ਸੋਚਿਆ ਹੀ ਨਾ ਕਿ ਇਹ ਉਹੀਓ ਪਿਆਰਾ ਹੈ, ਇਹ ਕੋਈ ਹੋਰ ਹੋਵੇਗਾ, ਕੋਈ ਡਾਕੂ ਜਾਂ ਕੋਈ ਚੋਰ ਹੋਵੇਗਾ, ਕੋਈ ਖੂੰਖਾਰ ਬਦਲੇਖੋਰ ਹੋਵੇਗਾ ਕਿ ਲਗਰਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਕਿਸੇ ਕਿਉਂ ਸਾੜਨਾ ਸੀ, ਕਿ ਉਹ ਪਿਆਰਾ ਕਿਸੇ ਕਿਉਂ ਮਾਰਨਾ ਸੀ। ਤੇ ਮੈਂ ਇਹ ਸੋਚਿਆ ਹੀ ਨਾ ਕਿ ਇਹ ਉਹੀ ਪਿਆਰਾ ਹੈ ਜੋ ਗਾਉਂਦਾ ਸੀ ਤੇ ਕਾਲੀ ਪੌਣ ਵਿੱਚ ਦੀਵੇ ਜਗਾਉਂਦਾ ਸੀ। ਇਸੇ ਗੱਲੋਂ ਖਫਾ ਹੋ ਕੇ ਹਨੇਰੇ ਦੇ ਖੁਦਾਵਾਂ ਨੇ ਪਿਆਰਾ ਮਾਰ ਦਿੱਤਾ ਸੀ। ਇਸੇ ਗੱਲੋਂ ਖਫਾ ਹੋ ਕੇ ਹਨੇਰੇ ਦੇ ਖੁਦਾਵਾਂ ਨੇ ਪਿਆਰਾ ਮਾਰ ਦਿੱਤਾ ਸੀ। ਤੇ ਹੁਣ ਜਦ ਵੀ ਕਦੇ ਲਗਰਾਂ ਜਿਹੇ ਮੁੰਡਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਮੈਂ ਕਵਿਤਾ ਪੜ੍ਹਾਉਂਦਾ ਹਾਂ, ਕਿਤਾਬਾਂ ਵਿੱਚ ਛਪੇ ਕਾਲੇ ਜਿਹੇ ਹਰਫਾਂ 'ਚੋਂ ਰੰਗ ਕੱਢਣੇ ਸਿਖਾਉਂਦਾ ਹਾਂ, ਤਾਂ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਜਾਪਦਾ ਹੈ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਵਿੱਚ ਪਿਆਰਾ ਵੀ ਬੈਠਾ ਹੈ। ਤੇ ਮੈਂ ਕਵਿਤਾ ਪੜ੍ਹਾਉਂਦਾ ਥਿੜਕ ਜਾਨਾ, ਸੋਚਦਾ ਹਾਂ ਕੀ ਪੜ੍ਹਾਉਂਦਾ ਹਾਂ। ਹਨੇਰੇ ਦੇ ਖੁਦਾਵਾਂ ਦੇ ਬੁਝਾਵਣ ਵਾਸਤੇ ਦੀਵੇ ਬਣਾਉਂਦਾ ਹਾਂ। ਹਨੇਰੇ ਮੰਦਰਾਂ ਦਾ ਮੈਂ ਪੁਜਾਰੀ, ਹਨੇਰੇ ਦੇ ਖੁਦਾਵਾਂ ਦਾ ਕਰਮਚਾਰੀ, ਕਿ ਹਰ ਪਿਆਰੇ ਤੋਂ ਵੱਧ ਕੇ ਜਿਸ ਨੂੰ ਆਪਣੀ ਜਾਨ ਪਿਆਰੀ, ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਮੈਂ ਕਦੇ ਕਵਿਤਾ ਪੜ੍ਹਾਉਂਦਾ ਸਾਂ, ਕਿਤਾਬਾਂ ਵਿੱਚ ਛਪੇ ਕਾਲੇ ਜਿਹੇ ਹਰਫਾਂ 'ਚੋਂ ਰੰਗ ਕੱਢਣੇ ਸਿਖਾਉਂਦਾ ਸਾਂ।